Hello everybody and welcome to the second issue of Retails with Ian Scott and Toby Barnes. We're calling them issues now because I've started like that and I'll carry on. Hi Toby, how are you?
I'm very well, mate. I'm very well.
Jolly good, jolly good. So today we're going to be having a chat and a discussion around Chinese retail. We've seen an awful lot of growth and development within Chinese retail, and it's an area that I'm particularly fascinated in, having managed two very brief trips to Shanghai a couple of years ago, and I got a chance firsthand to see a little bit, and I got a bit of a taste. So I'm by no means an expert, but I was always being fascinated how the advancement of retail, the technology and the innovation has really grown over in China. And it is quite interesting to note that just this month there's a report come out forecasting that online will be 52% of Chinese retail sales this year. So it'll be the first country to actually be majority online in retail. And it's interesting, by comparison, the forecast for the US is 15%. So it gives us an interesting sort of situation there.
It surprised me how low that is. I think for the last few years, Nike has put a lot of effort in the Chinese market. When we launched the House of Innovation, we launched House of Innovation in New York and at Shanghai at the same time. And those were seen to be, we were going to open our new concept in China and the US at the same time. And I think at that point, there's a lot of emphasis in the Chinese market. It's a very different market to North America, but it does somehow feel like it's the future. Every time when you go there, every time you see that, it just feels like it's not seen as a secondary market. It's actually been seen as sort of leading the world in many ways. And I think that it's why I wanted to introduce this week a friend and a colleague called her name is Sam Sterling. She is the Chief Strategy Officer for APAC for AKQA. AKQA is a world-leading design agency, and I must reveal that I used to work there, which is how I know her. I was part of the North America team, but Sam is, she's, as I say, she's Chief Strategy Officer for the APAC region, and she's lived in Shanghai for, I think, a couple of years, and she can kind of introduce and tell us a bit more about that. But as an outsider, has been very much observing and experiencing for herself what all that transition is like. And over the years, she and I have had many conversations. Whenever I needed to understand more about the market, she was always the first person I went to. So I thought it'd be really good to kind of introduce her. And it's one of the reasons that poor Ian is currently in the UK at somewhere past midnight, I think.
Yeah, it's just gone midnight. But I don't know, you've been very apologetic, but I don't mind. I mean, I do a regular monthly podcast with Kaiser and Bender, who are fabulous retail experts in Chicago, and a wonderful chap called Jeremy C, who's based in Singapore. And Jeremy always gets the poor end of the stick. We did one a couple of weeks ago and it finished at nearly 3 a.m. So he'll probably think I'm a wimp only doing one at midnight. So hi Jeremy, I'm getting there. Anyway, so let's move on now, and we'll invite Sam to sort of join the chat, and she can
that'd be great.
Explain a little bit more about everything that's going on in the world of Chinese retail. Can you hear us, Sam?
I sure can.
Oh, no video yet.
Can't see you at the moment.
You've been very coy.
One out of it.
There you are.
There we go. Fantastic. Hi, and thank you very much for joining us. I'll hand over the subject matters to Toby. He's sort of come up with a very sort of simple agenda for today. So we look forward to hearing your views. As I was just explaining to Toby, I've had two very brief trips to Shanghai. So I sort of think I know Chinese retail, and I know I'm going to be put in my place very much by someone who understands it, because I have a little bit of knowledge, which I know is a very bad thing.
Well, I was saying that I met you through AKQA, where I used to work a reasonably long time ago. And as the head of strategy for the region, it was always useful to be able to turn to you and say, okay, I have a theory. Is this right or wrong? And generally you're like, well, 20% right, 50% okay, and maybe something wrong. Or like, yeah, kind of, but also kind of introduce new insights and able to have a kind of really healthy conversation. And it would be irresponsible of two English people sat in two continents to talk about Chinese retail by reading the news. And so I know how much, and I've really enjoyed seeing your how you've moved into there and you actually live there. So it's not even like you're, in another place and you're experiencing it regularly. You, as both a consumer and also as a professional life, have kind of experienced some of those things. So we really wanted to get a better understanding from you and kind of introduce you in the conversation. And I think to Ian's point about agenda, one of the things that's really fascinated me has always been, and the kind of the final mile has always been an interesting part of me. And I think that you shared an article years ago, or felt like years ago, which had drone delivery, and drone delivery for you was like, actually, this is something we do everywhere else. And facial recognition allows you to pick these things up. And drone delivery is one of those things which was like, oh, that's science fiction. That may happen at some point. And then the other day you showed a video on LinkedIn, I think, of a robot in an office building delivering sandwiches, which I think I assumed sandwiches because it was a lunchtime video. And I thought that's incredible. And I've always assumed that's a real interesting kind of one-to-one experience. And it's something at Nike, we always used to look at trying to develop that one-to-one experience. But you've had a slightly different feeling about that, or you have a different reason why you think that that's focused, a kind of this more, the reason that China is able to do these things is more of a scale model, and you're able to kind of do these things in a much larger scale. So do you want to, I haven't even asked you to introduce yourself. You should really introduce yourself first and then talk about that. Sorry, we're very early days in this podcasting business. Yes. You must understand.
I'm glad to be an early guinea pig. There's so much in that. So very quickly, my name is Sam Sterling. I am the Chief Strategy Officer for APAC for AKQA, and I also serve as the Managing Director for the Chinese and Japanese businesses. And when I'm not working, I'm doing my doctorate in business administration in a joint program between Fudan and Durham universities, where I'm researching how organizations can solve for this problem of ambidexterity and simultaneously serve one market whilst exploring what their next opportunity will be. To answer your question, I think that this idea around scale is one that is particularly interesting in China, and it's something that I've seen is distinctly different from the rest of the world. In the West, a lot, we have this idea of human-centered design and design thinking that inherently puts the individual at the heart of the solution to every problem, which obviously has incredible benefit. The challenge is that when it comes to actually solving for those individual problems, if we put the individual at the heart of these, we have a tendency to solve for them in a way that is one-to-one rather than one-to-many. And that creates bottlenecks in solutions. And that creates this inability for a lot of solutions to actually be able to, go really large. And something that I've been quite inspired by and delighted by is that China has very little time for anything that isn't going to scale by a factor, because there's no value to having solutions that require one-to-one service when you are living in a country with 1.3 or 1.5 billion people. So just to come back to the retail example, or to the last mile example that you were talking about, in both of those cases, I think the drones, like the little bots delivering food, like lunch deliveries around an office tower. Just for clarity, what was happening there was people were ordering their food online using Ele.me or Meituan, which is kind of like Deliveroo or Uber Eats, but imagine that rather than only getting food and only from particular restaurants, you can get anything delivered from anywhere in your city within about 30 minutes or so. But the delivery drivers come from all of these places and they will arrive at the office tower. Now, rather than them loitering outside the office tower, waiting for someone to make their way down, to get up from their desk, to go through all the security and everything else, the delivery guy will go to one of these little bots and put the food in, put a code in, and it will then buzz the person upstairs and say, I'm on my way up to you. It'll collect a few of them, and then it sends itself in through the security area and goes up the elevator and goes out and waits for them at their lobby on their floor. Now, the inherent advantage to this is that it hasn't totally removed the one-to-many and the one-to-one concept, because you still have an individual with their phone who is buying food or buying something from a particular restaurant or from a particular outlet, and someone is putting that, on a bike and getting it to the building. But you're starting to see this instance in which the flexible human component is from the restaurant to that kind of last point of delivery, but then you can aggregate from that point onwards. And so we're putting the onus of the solution, we're putting the onus of that one-to-one, the only part of it that it really needs to be one-to-one, and we're allowing for scale in this other aspect. Another example of that is there's a retailer that we work with in Shanghai. They were using kiosks like on the walls in their store. Like almost everyone has seen them in the West. You go up to them and you can get more information about a product, you can scan something, you can do these sorts of things. They very quickly found out that it's a bit of a broken solution because it's one-to-one. You can only have one person stand in front of the kiosk screen. You might have someone else standing next to them. And then once you've got those kind of two people, the system falls apart, and now you need the person to go back to the shop assistant. What they did instead was replaced the kiosk screens with little QR codes on all of their merchandise, and allowed for all of their customers to just scan into the product using the screen that they bring with them, also known as their mobile phone. And then you're in an interesting position where there is inherent scale. Now your only limitation is how many people you can physically fit in your store, or the bandwidth that your servers have. It's not the kiosk screen. So I think we're seeing a lot of that more than anything.
It's interesting because I think we had so much conversation about smart screens, touch screens in Nike stores, smart mirrors, and so on. Like the interface, which is the interface? Which screen do people look at? And I think we went the other way. At Nike, we had the other challenge where we put sorts of screens up. People could, we've gone both ways actually. So we started with the screen, and then people had that same problem where it worked well with one person, with two, it just broke. And also people didn't know they were touchscreens. So everyone just felt they were advertising, and so no one interacted with them. The challenge was we switched to Nike App at Retail, which enabled people to scan products and other things, but you have a challenge of education then at that point, because for a lot of people, they don't know that the app can do the thing. They see the QR codes, but they don't know they can do that. And you then have a challenge of kind of teaching people how you can do that and why you should do it and so on. How have retailers kind of broken through that education model?
We definitely have an advantage in China in that QR codes are so ubiquitous. They are so prevalent that I was in hospital a couple of weeks ago. I had one of those bands on that they give you, and I'm not joking, it had a QR code on it. Like every time a nurse or a doctor would come, they would scan me. Like
when I was in Shanghai, even the buskers were using QR codes, and you paid by WeChat. And that was the buskers in the street. I couldn't believe it. It's funny because there's a lot of conversation over here going, what's all the fuss about QR code? It was so 10 years ago, and there's a feeling of why are we talking about QR codes again? And the pandemic's brought it back in here. But my view is it's just a trigger for information. The QR code, people are going, oh, it's so old fashioned. It's just a simple way of accessing information, isn't it? I mean, what's your view on that?
I think it's a driver of omni-channel experiences, because inherently we're ending up with this concept of like a ecosystem where everything is oriented around the individual. And so if I'm in a cafe here, for example, there'll usually be a QR code on the table, and I can just order from that. So I don't have to, it's got all the menu is in there, everything is available, and I can just order directly to my table from that. So if I'm in a store and I scan into a product, then when I go and look at the website for that store later, it'll know that I've looked at that product. So it creates these far more adaptive experiences. But I think the other element of that, though, like 10 years ago, for example, in China, when QR codes maybe weren't quite as prevalent, people were using them, or brands were using them very, very, very innovatively. So people were wanting to scan them because it was an experience. And they can be very, very cheap. They're very cheap. It's a very cheap tool. Anyone can create a QR code for literally nothing. But there was a property developer here who created an enormous, like a football field size QR code. And then they got all this social media attention and everything else. And they had 10 million scans of the QR code off the picture and from people flying over it. Brilliant. Like, there was people that were creating like QR code games, you know, like Pac-Man type games and things like this that had the QR code that they were running around in, or Tetris, things like that. It's just about creating an innovative use case. I saw someone do it on the side of a building with the lights from the office windows made QR code, so you could scan it from blocks away. Yeah. But when you see something like that, people will scan it because they want to know what it is.
It's been really interesting with the lockdown over here, because it's forced people to use it. So rather than necessarily being creating kind of experiences and the kind of novelty and the spectacle, you go to a restaurant today and like everyone's in masks, no one can hear anyone talk. There's a lot of worries about being close to people, and so every restaurant I've been to in the States has a QR code on the table. And it's either been my son, who is I have to say is a super nerd, so he's like, great, I want to scan everything, and he's going there. But you watch, you know, older generations who have maybe never seen it before, kind of understand it. That's the only choice. They don't have any other choice. There's no menus, there's no paper-based menus, there's no laminated menus, and so that has forced so many people. And these are chains as well. So you'll have like the McDonald's, the Red Robins, and the kind of big chains, as well as your independent mom and pop restaurants are having to use QR codes. And so you're seeing that, and that's kind of then extended to things like, I took my car in to get oil changed, and I drove up to the place and I scanned, while being in my car, I scanned to check in. So it really has, in some ways you could say it's accelerated the use of it, but the forcing nature has meant that, oh, it's automatically native on my phone. I didn't even know that. And then suddenly people, you know, and it is interesting how prevalent it suddenly is over the last few months.
Definitely. I think it comes through with a lot of other things as well. The pandemic was just forced change, you know, behavioural change, well, not permanent habit change, but certainly enforced. Certainly here in the UK, you know, we've the drive onto online has accelerated that engagement there. The QR codes have now come back here, whereas before, you know, they were here 10 years ago, they sort of phased out. And so you're seeing a lot of these, there's like a ripple effect where the pandemic has forced interaction here. I mean, I don't know what you think, Sam, but, you know, my view is, people have said to me, well, why is China more advanced? And my view is not so much the technology, it's the behavior of the consumer. They are more curious and willing to try new things. And so you try, if something new gets introduced, it will be embraced more. I don't know what your view are. The look on your face says you may not agree with that.
I'm just thinking about it because I think it's a little chicken and egg. I actually believe that brands here drive the innovation, and it's not necessarily consumers. To give you an example, I think in the US, the top 100 retailers account for, I don't know what it is now, but it used to be something like around 65% of all retail sales.
Yeah.
Whereas here, the top 100 retailers account for like 6%. Right. And what that means is that they're operating in this environment of intense competition. So if any brand isn't constantly pushing it and isn't constantly doing new, innovative, interesting things, there's thousands of competitors in the wings that are willing to take the spot. It can be very challenging because you're ending up with companies that are building business models that aren't sustainable because they're just trying to stay ahead of the curve, and they might go out of business. But now consumer expectations have been reset around this unsustainable model.
But do you think that the consumers are still more accepting of those ideas? I mean, when I was in Shanghai, January 2019, and I went into the Hummer test store, in Shanghai, and I'd read about it and I was really interested. You know, there's no conventional checkout with someone scanning codes, you know, and I watched this sort of elderly gentleman pay for his grocery with facial recognition. And I posted on LinkedIn, and I had people in the US and in Europe going, well, I don't want to do that. I don't want my face on a big screen. And we're more reticent about sharing data. And it made me think that, you know, in the West, there were reasons why the technology wouldn't work. And I talked about, I think it was at JD had introduced these Bluetooth shopping trolleys where you put the wrist strap on and the shopping trolley follows you. And again, the response over here was, oh, that will crash into people. You know, it's like we find reasons not to engage with a new idea. I don't know if that's just a British sort of skeptical side.
It sounds, the more
it
you
may
say
be a little bit more local than the West. It may be England. But you know, I found that there were these people, the reaction from people was quite negative and standoffish. Whereas, you know, I remember walking along I think it was the Nanjing Road, and there was a vending machine for Louis Vuitton fragrance, and there were 200 people queued outside to press a button on this vending machine, which you just wouldn't see over here. So it seems that consumers will engage in something more out of curiosity or try new things.
I would suggest that if a consumer doesn't see the value in the thing that you've created, you're not trying hard enough. You're not good enough. They haven't created a good enough use case. Like I'm aware that particularly in the West and to a growing extent in China, there is a concern around the use of data and privacy. But fundamentally, I guarantee you, everyone will give up their data if the experience, if the opportunity, if the thing is good enough, because it's just a currency.
Yeah.
So it just means that you're not creating a compelling enough use case for it. So I do believe that you will always end up with people who say that'll never work here, that'll never happen. But people said the same thing about Netflix. They said no one was ever going to stream movies. They said the same thing about Uber. I remember our general manager with the company I was working with, when I tried to expense an Uber ride about a decade ago, she said to me at the time, oh no, we don't use Uber, it's not safe. Like it'll never take off. Like there's always people who will say and do these things, but you're just not creating a compelling enough use case. And I think if that's the excuse that you have is, and I hear this a lot when I present these sorts of things to people in foreign markets, that'll never work here because we XYZ, that'll never work here. And I think if all you're looking to do is copy what we do in China and paste it into a different scenario, you're right, it'll never work. But if you can see the underlying thing here, which is that people are really understanding the priorities of a Chinese consumer and they're using technology to solve for that in a way that is meaningful for those consumers, then I think the possibilities are endless. But you're right, you guys don't have Meituan Dianping, you don't have Little Red Book, these are all platforms that are aggregators that have incredibly powerful commerce functionality built into them and all these sorts of things. You don't have the use of QR codes and bike sharing and all that sort of stuff that we do, but you do have access to all the technology. You do have QR codes. They're not magical.
No, I actually like the fact that they're actually wonderfully analog. You use this analog thing to kickstart this digital interaction, you know, and I sort of love the irony of that in many ways as well. So
I love the accessibility of that. It's so, like you said, buskers can use it because it has such great redundancy built into it. Anyone can accept payment using it because it has this redundancy built into it. I love that. I find it so democratizing in an ironic way.
It's interesting. One thing you mentioned about the platforms I've always found fascinating is one of the reasons from a design point of view that things have often broken is things like payment. It's things like, I remember years ago trying to build very simple interactions that involved someone paying for something, as simple as that. And the question was, well, hold on, we've got Android and we've got Apple. And so that's the two different payment systems. And actually Apple weren't as advanced as Android. And then we've got one banking system, but actually we've also got credit cards and we've also got, there's just like the plethora of different ways of doing things meant you could never get a large enough group to solve these things. And the things like Apple Pay is getting there, Google kind of getting that. And there's a lot of effort, and there has been effort from the big kind of four technology companies at the moment to start creating platforms. Facebook tried it with Facebook credits. Apple's trying to try everything with Apple Pay. But every now and again, those are tempted to be broken up. There's a lot of discussion in the US at the moment, and Europe as well, around the Monopolies Commission and seeing if we can break these up, because Google are clearly showing some competitive advantage by being a monopoly, whereas in China it's not so much a monopoly by a company, but at least there are platforms that it's very easy to build something on top of the platform to say, okay, facial recognition's handled, profiles handled, security's handled, commerce is handled, and I can just build the experience on top of that. I'm always interested to see whether there's going to be a point where platforms break up, and I'm a big believer in kind of open technology. Mozilla have been trying this for years, but it's never landing in the West, and I do wonder if there's some advantage from the platform that could be replicated somehow in the US.
It's interesting you mention the monopolistic nature of some of these platforms. Just in the last 2 weeks, the Chinese government has basically told Alibaba that they have to start divesting some of their media holdings because they have too large a grasp over public opinion in China. I've been quite interested, to your point, you just rattled off a whole bunch of things like facial payments, and there's all other things baked into that, like same-day shipping and all these sorts of things that in a lot of markets I see brands and retailers use as a point of difference. So they say, you can shop with us because we'll offer same-day shipping, we'll offer XYZ. The funny part to me is that these big aggregation platforms take care of all of that. So all of a sudden, all of these things that brands trade on in other markets are ubiquitous here. So they have to try so much harder. They have to offer so much more with regards to the unboxing experience. If we're talking retail, they have to offer so much more with regards to produce selection. Ian just spoke about Hema. It's called Fresh Hippo in English now.
That's it, Fresh Hippo, yeah.
It's a lot easier to say than Hema.
It is.
The Fresh Hippo have a webbed supply chain. So they have to do all of these other things to stand out and be different, and have people do things like use their QR code or whatever that is, because they can't rely on things like security, payment, quick shipping, all these sorts of things. And I think that's quite interesting, because effectively we're getting very slowly back to the space where it's not dissimilar to having, your little high street near your store where the grocer knows your name and they know what stuff you like, and they'll tell you when they've got that new batch of whatever fruit it is that you're into, or the clothing store knows what your style is, and they know, and they have to do things to really stand out, because they can't rely on all of these other things that they used to.
That's something that I'm fascinated by, and I in our last issue, we're calling these, we talked to Adam Levine from Hero, which is a video conferencing technology that I don't know if you know. Okay, you're nodding. And one of the reasons I really like it so much is that it really connects to human beings. There's some technology in the middle of it. There's video, there's all these other things that connects you through the website, and you can solve all those, but it connects to human beings. And I think that I've always fought really hard that the more technology we have, the more we have to focus on the human beings in that, because a human being will beat the technology every single time. Whether a store athlete will know, and Nike, they call them store athletes, sorry, store associate, they would talk about they know more about the styles and the designs and the history than anyone at HQ, and generally most consumers, and sharing that information is a joy in itself. You mentioned kind of going to the local groceries and talking about fruit with people, and I think I still enjoy going to individual places because of that human connection. With all of this focus on QR codes and scanning and screens and so on, how is China balancing the human interaction part with the kind of over indexing of technology?
That's a really
and when I say how is China, and I know that's a very hard question, how is China, the royal China?
Well, there's so many interesting aspects to that question. One of the things that I genuinely love about China is, in a landmass this big and a population this big, we have everything from a very agrarian economy all the way through to a hyper digitized, design-focused economy, all playing out simultaneously, where for the rest of the world,
Sam, sorry to interrupt, what does agrarian mean? An agrarian economy, what does an agrarian economy?
Agricultural.
Right.
Oh, okay.
So we haven't, like, large parts of China, people still make their money from farming and everything. And the farming environment in China is very different to the rest of the world, but it's still like farming all the way through to literally the world's largest Bitcoin miner is in China. Like, you have that playing out all in one country, all at the same time. So I think there's still what you talked about, like there's still literally the people going down to their local, their local restaurant, their local, grocer and those sorts of things, and having one-to-one relationships in these tiny, tiny towns, all the way through to something that looks like it belongs in Blade Runner in Shanghai or Shenzhen. And I think those cities, then those environments, the tier ones, are solving for what you talked about very differently to the rest of the world. I know that the pandemic, like Ian was saying, has created this massive use of QR codes elsewhere in the world. We've also seen a massive adoption of mobile commerce amongst older populations in China during the pandemic for the similar sort of reasons. But I think, like, the global brands that are solving for the challenge that you just painted in these tier one hyper-industrialized cities. Sorry, tier one, China tiers cities. You're familiar with the system?
Yes, yeah. So this is the Beijings and the Shanghais when you're talking tier one.
Beijing, Shanghai, Xi'an, Shenzhen. I think Chengdu is now, they change every now and again, but there's like 3 criteria that sort of say what tier they are, but they're the most developed in a lot of ways. I think they're solving for them using things like QR codes that create these experiences about people that allow them to be known. Yeah. So, like, if I go into a Nike store, I scan into a product, I buy maybe I don't even buy something, I will then receive a different experience. If I'm part of the run club, if I'm part of, if I use NTC, all these sorts of things, it all layers up information. The thing is, I don't have to see the same grocer every time, the same shop assistant every time, the same people at run club every time. I don't have to have all of those commonalities in place, because something rather, other than my brain, is collecting the sum of those memories. And, like, personally, I think that's really exciting. And I think it will be very interesting to see how that plays out in the coming years, because computers are obviously far less fallible than human memories, and there will be far richer information available to us. I think that will be really interesting.
And I think one of the real, sorry, and
no, I'm just aware of the time. That was also, carry on.
Oh, okay. Well, to bookend that, one of the things I think has been really interesting is, John, how you put that information in the hands of a store associate. There's been a number of experiments with store associates with an iPad, for example. I don't know why, it's always an iPad. And you put them in the iPad and they have a beautifully designed Salesforce-like profile. And here's Sam, and, like, I can tell you have all this information, and I can see your other past histories and all these other things. And I've seen that being overcomplicated. I've seen much simpler journeys where, okay, just tell the consumer one thing, and, like, boil down to, like, Sam really likes this, plus we know she likes black shoes and we have a black shoe, so just tell her about the black shoe. And that kind of oversimplifies the conversation. I think one of the challenges that we're going to face over the next few years is all that information we have about the consumer, the context, the time of day, the other consumers, and therefore the information that happens when you collate that. How does that enable a human to do something, I'm going to say better, augment that interaction with the consumer? Because the worst situation is you have someone say, hey, Sam, hi, hold on. It says here that you like shoes. Oh, hold on. And fuck it, I'm not off. I'm going to do my own thing. So I think that humans, as you're right, the computer's really good at storing memories, but they're not great at delivering that information to another human being yet.
No, and I'm really interested to see what that next evolution will be. And I think this is where facial recognition does actually start to become interesting. One of the retailers that we work with here is using opt-in facial recognition, so that when you walk into a store, the store associate is notified that you are in the store, and they get information about you, ironically on their phones, not on
iPad.
iPads, for exactly the reason you just painted. Everyone carries their phone with them. Finding your iPad, remembering where it was, all this sort of thing, is a problem unto itself. But then they know, they have this information. They know that you were in here last week. They know what you bought. They know what you've been looking at online. They, you know, on the store, they have all this sort of information. And I think this is a really nice loop back to where we began the conversation when I joined you anyway, around computers and, you know, automation and drones and these sorts of things, taking care of the stuff that humans add no value. Like in the case of the Ele.me, Meituan, the food delivery drivers coming to the building, they have done the most valuable part of their job, getting the food from the restaurant to the building. Them now waiting around outside or trying to solve for the security getting into the building and all these sorts of things, there's no added value. There's no human value in that. They've done the human. And in the case of luxury stores, for example, getting the delivery like to the person is not an interesting solve. It's the actual moment that they receive it that you have the opportunity for a human to do something special. Yeah. And so I think the ability to actually think, like codify that entire experience, break it all down and say, these are the parts where humans actually can be valuable. And then this is all the noise that we've just traditionally bundled together because that's the way things were done. We didn't have another solution. We can now unbundle that entire supply chain and just make sure the humans are doing the interesting human bits, and we can automate away all the rest of it. And I think that will provide so much more job satisfaction. It'll do so much more interesting things. You'll be able to create so many more experiences where you don't have humans taking care of computer jobs.
Yeah, 100%.
We've got 1 minute and 30 seconds left, I'm afraid, before we have to end. And I could carry on with this for hours and hours, because it's almost lifted the lid on some of the things that I hadn't considered and filled in some of the gaps. And it just leaves me wanting to ask a million more questions. So unfortunately, we're going to have to stop it here. But thank you so much for that, Sam. It's wonderful to get that sort of feet on the ground perspective, certainly from that sort of strategic and that analytical side as well. So thank you very much for joining us. Really appreciate you coming along and helping us with this. So maybe we'll revisit again maybe in the future to sort of carry on with this, because I'd certainly like to do that.
Fantastic. Thank you so much.
Cheers. Thanks very much, Sam.
Thanks, Sam.
So we've got about probably 30 seconds left, Toby. And I find that quite interesting, seeing this whole sort of development side around China. And I can see certain aspects of this will eventually filter through to the West. It's just seeing how quickly we'll actually pick up on that and move it forward, I think.
Yeah, we need to, one note for us is we need to be better at ending these. We realize that we're really good at starting them. We're really strong in the middle, some good questions. We're not very good at ending the podcast.
We're dreadful at it.
We're dreadful. We need to work out better ways of finalizing these and saying something like "see you next time" or smash subscribe buttons or something.
We're going to get cut off any second now. So thank you very much, guys, and we'll catch up soon. Cheers.
Thanks, Sam. See you soon. Bye.